everyone, it's Ellie from Clumhouse, and I'll show you how to do the lining expansion for the Portsmith Tote in this video. So we just released the Portsmith Tote lining and zipper expansion, and you can see the zipper expansion here. And I did that on a different video that you can watch. And then here's the lining showing up in that. And this lining expansion actually includes a pocket, so you can add a pocket to your Portsmith Tote. So follow along with me as we sew this, and I'll show you all of my favorite tips and tricks for sewing this. So with the lining expansion, we'll have wanted to sew up our Portsmith Tote to add the base and to base the base. Now, I sewed a zipper expansion onto this already. So if you are doing both expansions, you would have taken your zipper expansion up to this point and then switched over to the lining fabric. If you're just doing the lining expansion, you're gonna take the Portsmouth instructions just up to this point here, and then you'll jump back to the lining fabric here, and you'll start following this. Okay, so all of this will tell you, any of the signposts will tell you where you switch over between the patterns. It's the same spot that you switch over in the main Portsmouth pattern if you're doing either expansion. So I went ahead and cut all my yardage that I needed to add the lining expansion. So I have my lining piece, and then I have my pocket piece. All right, so let's go ahead and sew the interior pocket first. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna find the notches that I created on the top of the pocket, and I'm gonna use those notches as fold 2 marks, and I'm gonna connect them in order to draw a line and create double turn hem at the top of my pocket. So here's my first notch at 1 inch down from the raw edge, and I'm just gonna connect that. Now I'm on the wrong side of the fabric to do this. And then my second notch is a 1/2 inch away from that first notch. So I have 2 fold 2 lines, and I'm gonna take this to the iron and press it. Now if you're working with wax canvas, you're gonna wanna finger press that instead. So these are fold 2 lines, meaning my fabric folds to meet that. And there's my first press, and then I'm gonna turn this and press it again, because this is a double turn hem at the top of my pocket. Great, and then I'll head to the machine to sew this. So I set up my machine with an edge stitch presser foot, because I'll be sewing my hem down along an edge, and I've made my needle right adjusted because I'm using an edge stitch foot. That's gonna give me a nice clean 1/8 inch edge stitch. All right, so then let's go ahead and prep the other sides of the pocket. Okay, so I'm gonna wanna now create 1/2 inch single turn hems to the other 3 sides. I'm going to take this to the iron and press 1/2 inch single turn hems on all of these sides. So I'm preparing the pocket to sew it down to the lining. Okay, get a nice steam press on there, and I'm just working my way around all the edges, except for the top, which we already stitched a hem on. Try and get that in there without burning my fingers. There we go. All right, so now our pocket is prepped. Let's lay it onto the lining and get that sewn on too. Okay, so we're gonna jump back up here to number 1, and when we wanna create interior pocket placement marks on the right side of the lining that measure 4.5 inches in from the left side edge and 3 inches down. So I'm gonna decide what's my right and wrong side here. They look pretty similar to me, so I'm gonna just call this the right side. And I'm gonna come in with a ruler, and I wanna come 4.5 inches in from the left side, so let's start on the left side here, and 3 inches down. So I really like to try and grab both those measurements at the same time. So I have 4.5 in and 3 down, and then I'm gonna make a little mark for my pocket there. And then I'm gonna repeat that on the right side edge. So we're 4.5 in and 3 inches down. So 1, 2, 3, 4.5, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so now that I have my marks, I know where to place my pocket. Okay, so the marks are actually farther in than my pocket, and it's because I like to cover up my marks with the pocket so they don't show and I don't have to worry about them being in the way. So let me now grab my Clumhouse label and my pins, and I'm gonna go ahead and pin this down. And we're gonna sew it down with an edge stitch, pivoting around the bottom corners, and just get it all sewn down in one step. Okay, now I'm gonna throw my Clumhouse I made this label into the top, so you can choose if you want I made this or Clumhouse to show. So I think I'm gonna have an I made this right there. Super cute. And also, I'm always freaking proud of all the stuff that I make. So let's go to the machine and stitch that down. I'm gonna stay on my edge stitch, but I'm gonna move my needle to the left this time so I can get onto my pocket fabric. Okay, so you really wanna make sure you do a good back stitch up there and you sew your pocket all the way on, all the way to the top, so that that stitch lasts over time. Okay, I'm getting close down here to my pivot point. I'm gonna stop early with my foot and use my hand wheel so I can set the needle in the exact spot that I want it. And I wanna pivot when the needle's in the fabric but on its way up. So that's the best point to pivot in order to make sure you don't skip a stitch in the corner. Okay. Pivot on its way back up, but still in the fabric. Make sure you get that back stitch all the way up the corner there to make sure that your pocket's sewn on all the way. Okay, I like to always clip my threads right away so I don't have to deal with it later. And here is our interior pocket sewn on. So we're gonna sew the lining together, and the first thing we're gonna do is fold the lining in half, right sides together. So the right side has the pocket on it. And we're gonna align the top raw edges, and then we're gonna stick some pins in, or clips, whatever you want. That one is way too bent. Oh, so let me point out the gap in the lining. So we actually want to leave a 7-inch gap in the lining from this notch, which is 3 inches down to this notch. So we don't want to sew from here to here, so we can turn the bag out later through that area, okay? But on this side, we're gonna want to sew it all the way up. I keep grabbing the bent pins, which we all know is dangerous to sew with. All right, so let's go to the machine and sew that up. So I'm gonna start on the side that has no gap in the lining, and I'm gonna use a regular presser foot with a centered needle. Right there. And I'm gonna do a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I'll just go onto my faceplate right there. Align the fabric with the 1/2 inch seam allowance guide on the faceplate. All right, let's go ahead and sew the other side with the gap in the lining. So we're only going to sew to 3 inches down. And you really want to make sure you get a really good back stitch right next to the gap in the lining opening, because you're going to be pulling your whole bag through there. And then I'm going to jump down to here, do that nice back stitch again, and finish sewing the side seam, avoiding the gap in the lining. There. So let's get all these threads off. And there we are with our lining sewn in a gap. So we're gonna go ahead and box the corners of the lining fabric, and we want the lining to still be wrong side out. And we're actually gonna take our hands into the lining and form a triangle at the bottom corner. Now I'm just eyeballing this triangle right now. Then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn the seam allowance to the right. Now this is where I can actually check if my triangle is square. I have a 5-inch quilting ruler, and one of the cool things about this is I could use these black diagonal lines on here to make sure that my corner is square. Now if you don't have those, that's okay. What you want to look for is, I'm going to go ahead and color in my stitching line. Let's use pink, so you guys could see what I'm measuring against. And what I really want to see is 2.5 inches of fabric here up to the seam, and here all the way to the edge of the fabric up to the seam. So in this case, you need to ignore the seam allowance. We're not measuring to the edge of the seam allowance. We want to measure from the seam here, and we want to call the seam, the side seam, our middle point. Okay, and that's how we're going to make sure we have a nice square box corner. So once you find that, and say you weren't quite square, like your middle point was a little bit off kilter when you laid this on top, so let's go ahead and model that. Say I'm something like, see how might it show up for you guys. Something like this, where if you look at my side seam here, it's not at the 2.5, it's at the 2 1/4. So it's not quite, so I'm gonna have too short of a box corner here and too long of one here. What I wanna see is my side seam coming up to that 2.5. And that is ensuring that my box corner is indeed going to be even. Okay, so now I'm at the 2.5 all the way to the corner of the fabric there, and 2.5 all the way to the corner of the fabric there. So once you find that, then go ahead and stick some clips in there. Find that, and then also draw your stitching line, and you're gonna stitch on that line that we drew. Okay, so let's go ahead and find it on the other corner, so when I go to the machine, we're just ready to go. Okay, so I'm flattening it out. I'm just guessing right now. looking at the seam allowance as it's vertical, and then once it looks pretty even, I'm gonna turn my seam allowance to the right. And then I'm gonna check here, is my side seam, which is right here. No, it's hard to see my stitching. Is it at 2.5? And it is. So I'm gonna go ahead and draw my stitch on line there, and throw some clips in there. Then we're at the machine, we can just stitch both. So I'll meet you at the machine. All right, so now I'm gonna want a centered needle and a standard presser foot, which I have. And I'm just gonna stitch on that chalk line. So you're also welcome to press these box corners at the iron if you need to. If your fabric isn't keeping the shape that you want it to, that's fine too. Before you even come to the machine, you can give it a press if you need it. Okay. So now, the last thing before we're done with our box corners on our lining is we want to cut off the triangle from a 1/2 inch away from our stitch line, which is this pink. And I'm just going to go ahead and do that on both of them. And this is just going to reduce bulk in the corners of the bag later. All right, and so now we have our lining. So let's just turn our lining right side out, poking the bottom corners out. And here is our Portsmith lining ready for us to set in at a later step. So now that we finished the lining, sewing the lining together, we're gonna grab our Portsmith tote. And remember, if you're just doing the lining, it's not gonna have the zipper expansion attached to it. So you're gonna find yourself at this step here, which is just a short step about preparing the tote hem. And you'll see here, if you've added the zipper expansion already, then you've already done this. So you skip this step. Now, if you don't have the zipper expansion, you're gonna have to come to, sorry, it's a little weird with the zipper expansion in there, but I'm just gonna model this for you in case you didn't do it. You're gonna come to the wrong side of the tote at the top, and you're gonna find the notches at the top, and you're gonna connect them with a chalk pen. Here and here is another notch, same thing. And then you're actually gonna take this and you're gonna press it. So you're pre-creasing essentially these hems here. So I'm gonna flip this a little bit. You're just getting these creases in here for later when you need them in order to sew the lining and the exterior fabric together. So you're not gonna actually sew them down yet, but you do need to find them, and it's easier to find them before you sew the bag together. So that's what this step is about. So we have the top of the hem opened up, but we still have our creases, and we have our main tote folded right sides together. So we're gonna go ahead and prepare and construct the envelope fold. So the first thing you're gonna do is align the top edges of the bag and pin or clip them together. And then you're gonna come down here to the top edges of the base, and those should align. And once those align, you're gonna throw a pin or clip in above that spot. So that's important. You don't want a pin in the base itself. You only want a pin right above the stitching in just these 2 layers of fabric here. And then I'm actually gonna flip this over, tuck that in so it's not in my way, and I'm gonna find those same alignment points on this side of the bag. So I flip it over because it's, when you're sewing at the machine, the rule of thumb is the bulk of your work is to the left of your machine. And you never really want your pins hidden when you're sewing. So this side is face up when you're sewing this side, but this side is face up when you're at the machine sewing this side. So I put them on opposite sides. Okay, and now I'm gonna align the base here and stick a pin in right above the base there. Okay. Now I'm going to stick a couple more pins in along the sides, just kind of pushing the zipper bulk out of the way. So I'm just preparing to sew the side seam. Okay, and then I'm going to do the same thing here. Okay, so I really like pins and clips to help me hold stuff together. Okay, so now let's talk about the envelope fold. First thing I'm gonna do is actually finger press a crease down here at the very bottom. Then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna reach inside the bag and open up the bottom of the bag and the base in like an oval. And I'm gonna take this bottom center point, which is already notched, and I'm gonna align it with the tops of the base here and press that down. And I'm gonna do the same on this side too. So you're doing a pivot here, and then you're aligning that bottom with this. And then I can grab my steel roller actually and give myself a good press to really flatten this. Okay, then I'm gonna take this and I'm gonna grab this part here and pivot it back down, just like that. So notice my pivot here, I want these two edges to align. And over here, it's slightly not aligned, right? One's longer. So what that means is that I just didn't quite pivot at the center here. So I'm actually gonna come back up here, pivot a little bit lower, and get those to align. So you can adjust all of that. And then I'm gonna throw some clips in the very bottom. Okay, so there's one last thing I like to do for beginner stitchers, sewing the side seams, is go ahead and make yourself a 1/2 inch stitch on line. Okay, there's that zipper bulk in there. So this will just help you when you're at the machine. You can sew on that. So the envelope fold is prepped, and we're gonna go ahead and go to the machine and sew the side seams down. So this step will benefit from a magnetic seam guide, and I can put it on the faceplate at a 1/2 inch, and that'll help me, it'll help be a guide for my stitch. Set the needle in, take my pin out, and actually just finesse the fabrics a little. I have some bulk from the zipper there that was making the fabric behave weird. Now when you go to jump up onto this bulk here of the envelope base, the machine's gonna whine a little bit coming up onto that. So you can either give it a little push, and that kind of helps, and then you want to slow down a little. Get a good back stitch in there. Okay, and we're going to do that same stitch on the other side seam of the tote. Okay. Okay. Now we got our side seams sewn. So now we're gonna sew the exterior and the lining together. So we have our exterior bag with our envelope fold, and then we have our lining fabric here. And what we actually wanna do is just re-find our center points. So I'm actually gonna fold the top rim of the bag in half and align the side seams and find the center of each side of the bag, which you might have notched already, but if you haven't, you can always stick a pin in, vertical pin, to mark your center point, or also crease your fabric too, if it's wax canvas, because it'll show the mark. But let me just get those in here. Ouch. Okay. And then let's find our center points here. Same deal. You can also just snip into them. Less dangerous than pins. But here's my center point here. Again, snipping into them is good. Or pinning them. Okay, now that I found that, I'm going to go ahead and drop my lining into my exterior bag. Now this is going to be a right sides together, which is why my lining is turned out, but my exterior bag is not turned out yet. It's still inside out because I need this to be right sides together. I'm going to shake this so the lining can get all the way into the bag. And my zipper's open. It's just going to hang out in there. I'm really just interacting with the top rim of the bag. Okay, so that's nice and seated in there. So let's go ahead and match our center points and use one of these pins to pin our center point. Okay, and then I'm going to come over here and match this center point and take one of these pins and use it to pin my center point. Okay, I don't need that other pin now, and I don't need that one. And then I'm going to come to my side seams. Now here I'm going to take my side seams, align them, and nest them, meaning that one seam allowance goes one direction and the other one goes the other direction. Okay, this got pushed to the left and this got pushed to the right. Now that those are nested, I'm going to stick a pin in there, and then I'm going to come over to this side and I'm going to nest these seam allowances. Okay, the lining one went to the left and the exterior one went to the right. So our center points are in, our side pins are in. I pinned one in between the two, and I'm going to come over here and pin another. Now you're welcome to use clips on this step too. I just noticed that clips like to migrate a little bit more than pins, so I tend to err on the side of caution and use pins on this step. However, you have to be very careful that you don't prick yourself, because there's a lot of fabric handling happening around these pins. Okay, so we want to pins or clips every 2 to 3 inches, and I'm going to go to the machine and stitch this with a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the whole rim. Okay. So I find the easiest way to do this is to take the free arm off, and then I can sew around the perimeter. Okay, I still have my magnetic seam guide in there. I'm just gonna come up right here with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and sew around the edges. Okay, so now I'm gonna pull more bag in front of me. Working my way around the perimeter. I'm just going to reach back here and take out some of the pins that I no longer need so I don't accidentally grab them. So you also want to mind a little bit if you're starting to get any migration of the exterior and lining fabrics around the rim. If they're starting to bubble or not quite be the same size, this is where you would come in and do a little bit of easing. It's always nice actually to give a little bit of a tug on the fabrics as you do this stitch. It helps ease a little and get it sewn together nicely. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So of course when you're easing, which is sewing 2 pieces of fabric together that are different sizes, you always wanna make sure you're giving a dynamic pull from the front and the back of the fabric, but you never wanna pull against the fight the feed dog's ability to do an even feed, right? So if you're pulling, you still need to move with the machine. So now we're gonna pull the whole bag through this gap in the lining here. So I'm gonna reach in. I'm actually gonna take a moment right now with my hand to take fingers into each corner here and open up the envelope fold. And I actually wanna take my side seam and push it through first. So when I'm pushing this through the gap in the lining, what I actually wanna see here is I can form my envelope fold just with my hands, okay? So I wanna do that as I'm pushing it through. So let's go ahead and open up the envelope fold in the other corner and push this through, okay? So there's my envelope fold here. Okay, if it looks a little uneven, just finesse it into place because really it's just a bunch of folds. You can like shift it around. Okay, so now I'm going to push the rest of my bag through the gap in the lining. Okay, and then you can see the zipper expansion show up. So one thing I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to reach inside the bag. I'm going to flip the zipper expansion like this. So the idea with this, what I'm about to show you, is that later we're gonna do a top stitch when this is set into the bag. And when we do that top stitch, we really wanna be able to grab this seam allowance in the top stitch. And the top stitch is gonna land right here, which means that our seam allowance should be behind that there. So one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm just taking a moment to press the seam allowance towards the wax canvas side or towards the exterior side. Okay, just reaching inside the bag there and pressing that seam allowance up. Now it's probably still gonna shift on me, but at least I'm like starting to train it to go that direction. Okay, so now that we've done that, we're actually gonna close up the gap in the lining here. And my favorite way to do that is just quick and dirty. I push the seam allowance in and I run an edge stitch, an 1/8 inch edge stitch to close this up. So I'm just actually finger creasing this, but you're welcome to take it to the steam iron and press it. Throw some clips in here. And I'm going to take this to the machine and sew it up. Set my machine up for this stitch. My free arm goes back on. My edge stitch foot goes on. And my needle goes to the left. Okay, and I'm just going to sew this up. So the gap in the lining is sewn up, everything is closed up, and we're going to go ahead and stuff the lining into the exterior of the bag. Okay. Okay. So, although you might be tempted to treat this as the top of the bag, it's not. This is not the top of the bag. The top of the bag is this crease right here. Remember that crease we made a while ago? That is actually the top of the bag. So let's go ahead and reform that crease. Okay, so that's gonna set the lining down and it's gonna make it be the same height as the exterior bag. Okay, so I'm gonna just take a moment and form the bottom corners of the lining just into the bottom of the bag. And then I'm gonna take a moment up here and reform the top crease. So that might look, if you're not working with wax canvas, it might look like going back to the steam iron and repressing it. Okay. So one of the things you wanna make sure of is that you've actually tugged the lining all the way down and that it's not folded up into the hem, because otherwise your lining will not reach the bottom of your bag. So the lining is on purpose shorter than the bag because it only goes to here. The rest of the height of the bag is with the waxed canvas, okay? So that's just something to look out for. So I'm just reforming the top of the bag, getting ready to do my next stitch. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a little bit more finessing here. We're going to reach in here and fold the seam allowance up into the hem. So if you have a zipper expansion on, it's going to be really easy because the seam allowance already wants to be in the hem here. So that's fine. We're going to go ahead and stick a pin in there. You're welcome to not pin it too, but you'll just have to deal with and manage the fabric if it wants to shift on you when you're sewing. So these are all in the right spot because the zipper expansion makes it go that way. So here I can tell my seam allowance is wanting to flip to the lining side, but my job is to actually come in and flip it up into the hem because I really want to capture that seam allowance into my top stitch that I'm about to sew. So I just flipped that up. So I'm going to go ahead and stick a pin in here to just hold it in place. Okay, and then I'm going to work my way around the tote. right here, the seam allowance is in the right direction into the top hem because the zipper expansion is helping it lay that direction. Okay, so I'm just gonna stick some pins in to keep everything in place before I go and stitch. Okay, and I'm in the last section here. And I have a moment where I can just make sure everything's forming up really well and matching up, and it looks great to me. And I can feel the seam allowances in the hem and not down there. So I'm going to stick a pin in to these spots and help it stay there. And then we'll go to the machine and we'll sew that top hem down, which is the last step in our lining expansion. So let's go do that. All right, so I'm going to stay on an edge stitch foot here because I actually want to use this hem as an edge stitch, as an edge, and so an 1/8 inch edge stitch right to the side of the hem here, top stitching it down, which means that I want to put my needle to the right. Now, if you are on a machine that only has a left adjusted needle, you can put the bulk of your work into the throat of the machine there, or you can just sew without an edge stitch. Okay. So, just a little note for you all. This stitch will show on the exterior of your bag. So just be mindful of that as you're sewing and maybe even in your thread color choice. Sometimes if you're using an edge stitch, it gets caught on certain things. So here's the edge stitch blade being caught. So I'm actually just gonna lift it up and put it back down again so it's on top of my zipper fabric. That way it can glide right up onto it. This stitch can also benefit from a little bit of soft easing as you sew it. So if you're going to ease, just be careful on which parts of the bag you're grabbing if there's a pin in there. So I'm just going to give it a little tug, a little bit of an ease, and it's going to help everything kind of seat in a little bit cleaner. Okay, and we're working our way around the top. So as I sew, I pull more forward. Just giving it a very slight ease as I sew. So see this, take a moment here. This is very messy looking. I'm not gonna go and stitch yet. I really need to sort of like set my fabric up, set my stitch up in what I'm about to sew in a way where it feels like I'm gonna get the straight stitch that I'm looking for. I'm also checking, is my seam allowance in the hem? And it is. And am I able to really flatten out and make sure everything here is straight? Then I can go and sew. So you can take moments like that as you're sewing along to straighten everything out and feel a little bit more confident about how the fabric is set up before you stitch it down. Okay, I'm gonna have to lift the edge guide up onto the zipper fabric. Just a little bit of a lift there. Same thing here. Just pulling everything. And we're getting close back to where we originally started soon. Okay, so you just want to meet up with your beginning of your stitch there. All right, so let's go back to the table. take our clips out. And there is our lining expansion with the zipper. There we go. So it looks really cute. I really love these expansions on the Portsmith Tote. They give the Portsmith Tote just a little bit more structure. They give the Portsmith Tote a pocket, which is great, and just a little bit more security here if you want to step up your Portsmith Tote game. So head back to the original Portsmith instructions to attach your leather straps and finish up your Portsmith Tote.